In terms of what is irremediable, careful consideration needs to be given about what this means in the context of mental illness. Irremediable, of course, cannot simply mean incurable, as many conditions in psychiatry and medicine are considered chronic and not curable, but things may be done to remediate or improve the situation. Multiple treatment options exist, typically, for even the most severe instances of mental illness, where symptoms and suffering may be treated and reduced, even if not cured. And as importantly, it's essential to remember the person is more than just their illness. Psychosocial factors play an enormous role in a person's illness experience, particularly so in many mental illnesses. For example, if you take an overly narrow view of assessing irremediable only in the context of potential symptom improvement through biomedical treatments in severe depression, you ignore potentially remediating or improving the person's experience by addressing key factors like social isolation or poverty.
I am a minister in a church. I have done many funerals of people who have died with and from mental illness. If their deaths were all preventable, if nothing is irremediable or refractory, where's the gap? This is a genuine question. If you were saying virtually nothing is irremediable, yet I know of dozens and dozens of people who have died with and from mental illness, where is the gap? Why have they died if it was possible? Where have you failed, or where have we failed?
So there are many facets to that question, actually, because in some cases, if the person has committed suicide, as I was mentioning, it often reflects that they haven't actually had access to psychiatric care. It's not to say all suicide is preventable.
Many of them that I know have actually, 3 of them have been in hospital, in care, and have had committed suicide under the watch of a physician who is a psychiatrist.
And as I said, I'm not suggesting that we're saying all suicide is preventable if someone is seeing a psychiatrist. That's not what I was saying. But when you're asking about you're asking a bit about what is the threshold of defining something as irremediable, in a way. And I don't know if that's a question for the profession to answer or society to answer. In some ways, there are concepts in law that talk about probability. My clinical background was as a psycho-oncologist at Princess Margaret Hospital, Cancer Hospital. And even with patients with cancer, you can anticipate what the outcome may be, but you don't know 100% for sure in many cases. So at what threshold do we say something is completely irremediable or not?
That's what we're asking you for, because we are, no, that's exactly what we're asking. I think I'm not going to get an answer.
I don't have an answer for you on that right now.
Okay, we have a statement, but not an answer. We have a statement from you that says nothing is irremediable, but not an answer on what the threshold would be.
Actually, we were not saying that nothing is irremediable. That's not what we said.
Okay. If I may, you said that we should not conflate 2 important terms, the irremedial, which is the test in Carter, and treatment-resistant depression. And I'm trying to understand, are there conditions that would mean that, I can't think of a scenario where a purely mental condition could meet the criteria in Carter. Because you say we shouldn't conflate those 2 terms. Are there irremediable psychiatric conditions that you can suggest that would meet the test? Standalone, no biophysical, just standalone psychiatric illnesses that would meet the test of irremediable?
So, again, as I mentioned, in the vast majority of cases, even in the most severe situations, something can be done to attempt to ameliorate. Failing all of that, is it conceivable that there could be an illness that's irremediable? That would have to be assessed honestly on a case-by-case basis. What we're suggesting is that the process, the thinking process behind why the patient is making this request, that needs to be teased apart very carefully, because their perception of something being irremediable may actually not be irremediable.
Well, that's the problem. I'm having trouble thinking of a situation based on your testimony that would meet those very stringent requirements of irremediable.
it's challenging to say, I can't make a definitive statement that nothing ever could. I don't believe that anyone could say that. But I share your difficulty in thinking of many that would, if any. But I think it's not possible to say nothing ever could. In medicine, we consider 4 broad components when assessing capacity: the ability to make a choice, the ability to understand relevant information, the ability to appreciate the situation and the consequences of decisions, and the ability to manipulate information rationally. Even when persons with mental illness can express a choice and understand and recall information, their appreciation of the situation, of present and future expectations, and ability to manipulate information rationally can be affected by the cognitive distortions previously discussed. Now, I want to emphasize that none of this is to suggest that simply the presence of any mental illness alone impairs people's judgment and cognition. But by definition, in the PAD discussion, we are talking about the most severe situations. And in severe cases of mental illness, the risk of such cognitive distortions is, of course, higher. And we think with our brains, not with our hearts or limbs. All these issues speak directly to the court's concern about ensuring the person is not induced to take their life at a time of weakness. Apart from the actual suffering caused by symptoms, if cognitive distortions are present, these risk undermining the person's decision-making process. In the court's consideration of factors of coercion or duress, it would be as if the mental illness is undermining the person's autonomy to make a decision free from the influence of cognitive distortions. It's this recursive nature of symptoms on the evaluative process, where the very symptoms of mental illness may interfere with the person's evaluation of their mental illness and its present and future impact, that poses the challenge.
I would like to come back to one of the criteria that the Supreme Court has stated in Carter, and I read it to you. You certainly knows it. A person has to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, and my point is, that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. So in other words, there is an element of subjectivity of the person who endure the suffering. And when you endure the suffering, you can endure physically and you can endure mentally. And it's you who endures. A doctor might come to a conclusion that what you endure may be curable. But if the person has the specific conviction that it is intolerable to that person, where do you intervene, or should you intervene to prevent that person from exercising his or her right to be physician-assisted in dying?
So, you're actually hitting on issues we struggle with in medicine and psychiatry all the time, between the principles of autonomy and beneficence. So the physicians, we want to take care of patients. The patient also has their own autonomy to make decisions. The tricky part with mental illness is that sometimes the illness can actually undermine the patient's autonomy. So some of the decisional points and processes that I'd alluded to before, that idea of having a sense of foreshortened future, literally perhaps not being able to see that there is a future. And if a patient makes a decision because they're unable to see something because of the illness, then how do we reconcile that with full capacity? And I'll give you another example, actually, from my own practice just a few weeks ago, actually. I've got a patient I've been following for many years, and he's chronically suicidal on and off, and in between actually has good quality of life at times. And the latest thing that brought him into the kind of close to a suicidal state was ameliorated by getting some public transport for him, so he could be a bit more independent and go around the city and actually interact with people. So sometimes when things seem irremediable to a patient in a state of depression, it's because cognitively they cannot see a future, they cannot anticipate that something positive could change, And that's part of our role then, to make that assessment if the cognitive distortions are impairing their decision.
Then you would impose a treatment.
There's, again, not necessarily. The issue of capacity is specific to
But in
each
that very
question.
specific decision of the person deciding that that person wants to be assisted by a physician to die, in that specific context, you would prevent that person from exercising that decision.
There's a difference between imposing a treatment and saying that a person lacks capacity to get a treatment.
But in that context, you would prevent the person from, in his or her opinion, that suffering is intolerable for that person in that specific condition in relation to what that person feels himself or herself. So in fact, you would substitute your capacity or your decision to the decision of the person.
Well, at the point in time, if the person lacked capacity, that is true. If the person was deemed to lack capacity, that is true. There's a model called the recovery model, where the decisions that patients make, they want to be able to make them even if they're mistakes. But the idea there is that they want to learn from their mistakes. This particular decision, you can't learn from it if it's a mistake.
Yeah, but which distinction do you make between a person who is in a mental condition and another person who suddenly happens that that person suffers, for instance, from a cancer, terminal cancer within 2 or 3 months, and that person mental capacity totally changed, because of course we cannot prevent, we don't know, as you said yourself, how a person will react to his prospective death in front of him.
Those decisions we're already making. We already make those kinds of capacity decisions.
Well, in that case, you will not intervene to prevent that person from making that decision, because that person doesn't suffer from a permanent mental illness condition, even though you say that it doesn't happen to be remediable. But in the context of somebody who will learn that it will be, it is in the course of being terminally ill, that person's mental capacity is totally changed as much as the person who suffers from a mental condition.
You can have two people with the exact same symptomatology and experience, and one may have capacity to make a decision and the other one might not. This is why I'm saying it comes back to the principles of capacity assessment.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Senator.